A chill wind sweeps across the Bavarian Alps as Hanna Reitsch, Germany's most famous test pilot, arrives at Hitler's mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. It's February 28, 1944, and the tide of World War II is quickly turning against the Third Reich. But now, inside the dimly lit study of the Berghof, Reitsch stands before the Führer, her eyes gleaming with determination. Reitsch gestures to blueprints spread across Hitler's desk. The designs seem to depict a strange, tiny flying machine, completely unlike anything the Luftwaffe has deployed until now, more like a missile than an aircraft. But as Reitsch lays out her ideas, it soon becomes clear that the mission she has in mind is just as unprecedented, an extreme, almost unthinkable plan that would ask more of German aviators than ever before. At first, Hitler is taken aback. This drastic proposal is too gruesome, even for him. As Reitsch describes potential targets, Allied shipping, power plants, even Buckingham Palace, his interest grows, but he's still not convinced. The price to pay would be too great. Yet Reitsch refuses to give up, arguing that this might be their last chance to save the fatherland. For a long moment, silence reigns. Then, slowly, Hitler nods his assent. The Nazis are about to get to work on what will become the Führer Fi-103R, codenamed Reichenberg, their most desperate gamble yet. The roots of the controversial Reichenberg project can be traced back to the early years of World War II. As the conflict intensified, both Allied and Axis powers raced to develop new weapons that could provide a decisive advantage. Germany, in particular, invested heavily in advanced technology, resulting in a series of innovative but sometimes impractical wonder weapons. One such creation was the V-1 flying bomb, officially designated Führer Fi-103. The V-1 was part of Nazi Germany's Vergeltungswaffen, or vengeance weapons program, which also included the V-2 ballistic missile and the never-completed V-3 cannon. These weapons were intended to bolster German morale and demoralize the Allies, particularly the British population, who had endured years of bombing. Initially developed in 1942 by the German Luftwaffe, the V-1 was essentially a cruise missile, designed for the terror bombing of Allied targets, particularly London. It was one of the first guided missiles used in war, and the forerunner of today's cruise missiles. However, even before it was first launched, there were concerns about its accuracy. Testing exposed its inability to hit precise targets, often missing by miles. German scientists began exploring different ideas to make the V-1 more effective. Yet, when Germany's chances of winning the war began rapidly deteriorating after defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, Nazi leadership frantically attempted to reverse their fortunes. In this climate of hopelessness, even the most outlandish suggestions would be considered. Among those attempting to improve the V-1 was Otto Skorzeny, a Waffen-SS officer famous for his unconventional operations, who gained notoriety for his role in the rescue of Benito Mussolini in September 1943, and was known for his daring and often unorthodox tactical thinking. It was from Skorzeny's fertile, if somewhat twisted imagination that sprang an audacious concept, a manned version of the V-1. By adding a cockpit to the flying bomb, a skilled pilot could guide the 2,000-pound warhead to its objective with far greater accuracy than the autonomous V-1, allowing it to attack specific high-value targets. Theoretically, the pilot would bail out moments before impact. However, given the aircraft's high speed and the pilot's placement directly in front of the jet intake, the chances of survival would be virtually non-existent. This was an extreme suggestion, even for a regime as brutal as the Nazis. Never before had a plan been put forward that would ask aviators to sacrifice themselves for their country. Even the Japanese would not carry out kamikaze attacks until October 1944. Yet, with Germany now looking down the barrel of an Allied victory, the idea of a piloted V-1 was not without its supporters. Among them was Hajo Hermann, a member of the Luftwaffe operational staff and a confidant of Hermann Göring. However, perhaps the most enthusiastic proponent was pilot Hanna Reitsch. a remarkable figure in her own right. Reitsch had been the first woman to fly a helicopter, a rocket plane, and a jet fighter, and had survived numerous crashes during her career as a test pilot. Her dedication to the Nazi cause was unwavering, and she saw Skorzény's proposal as a way to give Germany a chance to win the war. In late February 1944, Reitsch traveled to Hitler's Berchtesgaden mountain retreat in Bavaria to see if she could convince the Führer to put the idea into practice. She told him that such a project would, quote, require men who were ready to sacrifice themselves in the conviction that only by this means could their country be saved. Hitler was initially reluctant to agree to the plan. He did not believe Germany's situation was serious enough to warrant the implementation of such a severe measure, and he was concerned about the psychological impact that it could have on the country, as he did not believe it fit the German culture. Nevertheless, Reitsch eventually persuaded him to approve the project. Development of the Reichenberg began in secret in 1944 under the supervision of the German Research Institute for Sailplane Flight. The project's codename, Reichenberg, was derived from the capital city of the Reichsgau Sudetenland, present-day Liberec in the Czech Republic. The development team faced numerous challenges. They had to transform a purely mechanical, unmanned flying bomb into an aircraft that could be controlled by a human pilot. This required significant modifications to the V-1's design, all while maintaining its essential characteristics as a high-speed, low-altitude attack vehicle. The most obvious modification was the addition of a cramped cockpit in the fuselage, directly in front of the pulse jet intake. This placement put the pilot in an extremely precarious position, mere inches from the screaming engine and with no realistic means of escape. The cockpit itself had a minimalist design, to say the least. It contained only the most basic flight instruments, an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, a clock, and a turn and bank indicator. A simple bucket seat and a plexiglass canopy completed the pilot's accommodations. There was no ejection seat. The chances of a pilot surviving a mission were considered so low that such a feature was deemed unnecessary. To make room for the cockpit, one of the V-1's fuel tanks had to be removed and relocated. The aircraft's controls were also modified to allow for manual operation. Small wings were added to improve the aircraft's handling characteristics, and the tail fin was enlarged to increase stability. The Reichenberg came in several variants, each designed for a specific purpose in the training and operational use of the aircraft. The R-1 was an unpowered glider used for initial pilot training. It allowed pilots to become familiar with the Reichenberg's unique handling characteristics without the added complexity of engine management. The R-2 was also an unpowered glider, but it featured a second cockpit for an instructor. This variant was crucial for safely training pilots in the Reichenberg's unusual flight characteristics. Then came the R-3, a dual-control trainer powered by a pulse jet engine, which provided a transition from glider training to powered flight, allowing pilots to experience the full flight envelope of the Reichenberg under the supervision of an instructor. The R-4 was the operational version, essentially a V-1 with a cockpit squeezed in. This was the variant intended for actual combat missions. The final variant, the R-5, was developed as a shorter-nose training aircraft for the Henkel AG-162 jet fighter. This variant showcases how the Reichenberg project influenced other areas of German aviation development. Like the V-1, the Reichenberg used a pulse jet engine, a type of jet engine that operates in pulses rather than providing continuous thrust. The Argus AS-014 pulse jet used in the Reichenberg produced about 350 pounds of thrust, giving the aircraft a top speed of around 400 miles per hour. The pulse jet was both an advantage and a disadvantage. On one hand, it was simple, cheap to produce, and capable of operating at high speeds. On the other hand, it was incredibly loud, earning the V-1 the nickname Buzz Bomb, produced intense vibration, and only functioned effectively at high speeds, making takeoff and landing extremely challenging. To overcome the takeoff issue, the Reichenberg was designed to be launched from a carrier aircraft, typically a Henkel HE-111 bomber. This approach allowed the Reichenberg to be brought close to its target before launch, extending its range and reducing the time the pilot would have to endure the punishing conditions of pulse jet-powered flight. Meanwhile, as news of the project spread, volunteers began to come forward. The idea of a dramatic, noble sacrifice in service of the fatherland appealed to many young, fanatical Nazi pilots. By October 1944, about 70 pilots were in training to fly the Reichenberg. Known as the Leonidas Squadron, in reference to the Spartan king, who famously led his 300 soldiers in a desperate fight to the last man against the much larger invading Persian army at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. These pilots were told they would fly the Reichenbergs on one-way missions against critical enemy targets, sacrificing their lives for the greater glory of the Reich. Training the Reichenberg pilots was to be as unorthodox as the aircraft itself. The final stage of training involved simulated attack runs, with pilots expected to aim their aircraft at targets on the ground before pulling up at the last moment. The psychological aspect of training was perhaps even more challenging than the physical. Pilots had to be prepared not just to risk their lives, but for a one-way mission. This required a level of fanaticism and devotion to the Nazi cause that went beyond even the considerable sacrifices already being asked of German soldiers and airmen. Testing of the Reichenberg began in the autumn of 1944 at Lars Airfield. The results were not encouraging. The first 2 test flights, using the unpowered glider variants, ended in crashes that seriously injured the pilots. It quickly became apparent piloting the Reichenberg was an extremely challenging and dangerous task. The Reichenberg's flight characteristics were unlike anything most pilots had experienced. The small wings provided minimal lift, meaning the aircraft had to maintain high speeds to stay airborne. What's more, there was a lack of proper landing gear, making conventional landings impossible. Instead, pilots of the test versions were expected to bring the aircraft down in a controlled crash landing, a harrowing prospect even for experienced test pilots. In an effort to prevent additional mishaps and identify the root cause of these challenges, Hanna Reitsch decided to conduct many of the subsequent flight tests herself. Reitsch's involvement brought valuable publicity to the project. Her status as a national hero in Germany helped to attract more volunteers and to counter growing skepticism about the project among some military leaders. However, even Reitsch couldn't fully overcome the Reichenberg's inherent dangers. She experienced firsthand the Reichenberg's difficult handling characteristics and the bone-rattling vibrations of its pulse jet engine, and endured multiple accident landings, though miraculously managed to emerge unharmed each time. Another exceptionally skilled test pilot, Heinz Kensch, also became involved in the evaluation of the Reichenberg. During a November 5, 1944 sortie flown by Kensch, the R3 variant's second test flight, internal vibrations caused one of the wings to separate from the fuselage. Kensch successfully bailed out, though extricating himself from the confined pilot's compartment proved troublesome. The investigation revealed that the FI-103R required a comparatively high velocity to avoid stalling, a fact unknown to the pilots, who'd been trying to touch down at airspeeds insufficient for the aircraft to remain airborne and controllable. The Reichenberg's persistent problems did little to garner support for the project from within the German military establishment. Many officers had resisted the idea from the beginning and were hoping it would never come to fruition. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters and a highly respected ace, was particularly vocal in his opposition. He argued that such extreme tactics were contrary to the traditions of the Luftwaffe, and that the lives of trained pilots were too valuable to be thrown away in such a manner. His opposition carried significant weight, given his status within the German military. Moreover, as the war situation deteriorated, practical problems began to mount. Fuel shortages made training difficult, and Allied bombing disrupted production. By the end of 1944, only about 175 Reichenbergs had been manufactured, far short of the numbers needed for any significant impact on the war. The final blow to the Reichenberg project came from an unexpected quarter. In March 1945, Werner Baumbach, the commander of KG-200, Special Operations Wing of the Luftwaffe, met with Hitler and Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments. Baumbach argued passionately against the Reichenberg, stating that the type of missions they would require were contrary to the German warrior tradition. Baumbach's argument resonated with Hitler, who had always styled himself as a soldier and appealed to martial virtues in his speeches. Besides, the implementation of such desperate measures probably seemed futile at this late stage of the war. Having never really been comfortable with the project from the start, Hitler agreed to the cancellation of the Reichenberg program. The Fieseler Fi-103R Reichenberg, though never seen combat, stands as a testament to the desperate measures contemplated by the Nazi regime in its final months. Its legacy is complex, representing both the depths of fanaticism and the ethical dilemmas faced by scientists and engineers under totalitarian regimes. While the project showcased the regime's disregard for human life, it also contributed to technological advancements that influenced post-war aviation. The challenges of controlling an aircraft at the V-1 speeds provided valuable data for future jet and rocket plane designs. The concept of a pilot guiding a missile with extreme precision foreshadowed the development of modern precision-guided munitions and cruise missiles. Today, a handful of Reichenbergs survive in museums worldwide, including the Flying Heritage and Combat Armor Museum in Washington, the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and the Lushenden Air Warfare Museum in England. These silent testaments serve as powerful reminders of the horrors of war and the dangers of unchecked ideology.